Hey family, welcome to Mr. Gray Family, where every story begins with us. Jacob stood outside room 214 with one hand pressed against the wall like he suddenly needed help staying upright. The hospital hallway was quiet except for the soft squeak of shoes somewhere in the distance and the low hum of machines coming from half-closed rooms nearby. It was almost 2 in the morning, but time barely felt real anymore. Not after the last 4 days, not after the way Demetria looked at him 10 minutes earlier. He lowered his head and rubbed both hands over his face slowly. His wedding ring scraped against his skin as his fingers trembled. He hadn't noticed the shaking until now. Inside the room, his wife was finally asleep, or at least pretending to be. Jacob could still hear her weak voice in his head. "Babe, you should go home for a few hours." Like she hadn't been the one lying in a hospital bed with wires attached to her chest. Like she wasn't the reason doctors kept walking in and out, speaking in careful tones that made his stomach tighten every single time. He swallowed hard and looked through the small window on the door. Demetria always looked warm to him, alive, even when she was tired, even when she got sick before. But tonight was different. The color in her face looked faded under the hospital lights, and for the first time since he met her, Jacob felt something he didn't know how to control. Fear, real fear. The kind that makes your chest feel tight and hollow at the same time. A nurse had used words earlier that kept replaying in his head. Complications, progression, concerning results. Nobody had said the word dying, but Jacob heard it anyway. He pushed himself off the wall and started walking toward the vending machines at the end of the hallway. His body felt heavy from exhaustion. Same jeans for 2 days, same boots. Same untouched coffee sitting in waiting rooms getting cold beside him. Halfway down the hallway, he stopped. 2 nurses stood near the nurses' station talking quietly while reviewing a chart. Jacob wasn't trying to listen, but then he heard one of them say softly, "She kept worrying about his stress more than her own condition." Jacob froze where he stood. The second nurse sighed. "I know. Honestly, that's the part that got me. Especially after the latest results started looking hopeful." Jacob stared at the nurses without realizing he'd stopped breathing for a second. Hopeful? The word didn't fit anything he'd heard all week. One of the nurses glanced up briefly before lowering her voice again. She delayed seeing specialists way too long. She said quietly. By the time she came in, she was already exhausted. The other nurse shook her head while flipping through papers on the chart, and she still kept asking whether her husband was sleeping enough. Jacob felt his throat tighten instantly. His eyes dropped toward the floor. That sounded exactly like Demetria. Even now, even after collapsing, even while lying in that hospital bed looking weaker every day, she was still thinking about him. A memory hit him so suddenly it almost hurt. Earlier that night, Demetria had looked over at him from the bed after a long silence. Her voice had been soft, tired. "Jacob?" He remembered pulling his chair closer immediately. "Yeah, baby?" She looked at him for a few quiet seconds before speaking again. "Did you ever think we'd end up here this young?" Jacob tried joking the way he always did whenever he got scared. "Nah. You still owe me at least 40 more years of bossing me around." Demetria smiled a little at that. Just a little, but her eyes stayed sad. Then she reached for his hand weakly and whispered, "If something happens to me, promise me you won't shut everybody out." Jacob remembered shaking his head instantly. "Don't talk like that." But she kept looking at him in that quiet way she had whenever she was trying not to cry. "Promise me." Standing in the hallway now, Jacob pressed a hand over his mouth hard enough to stop the shaking in his jaw. For the first time since she'd been admitted to the hospital, he realized how terrified she must have been, too. Not just him, her. And somehow she still spent more energy trying to protect his feelings than talking about her own fear. Have you ever loved somebody so deeply that you started hiding your own pain just to keep them from worrying? If you have, comment below. And if stories like this mean something to you, take a second to like this video and subscribe to Mr. Gray Family. It genuinely helps these stories reach more people who need them. Welcome to Mr. Gray Family, a storytelling universe built for people who crave meaning, emotion, and unforgettable narratives. Here, every story begins with a spark and ends with a feeling you'll carry long after the video ends. Love, betrayal, family, secrets, lessons, it's all here, wrapped in immersive narration that makes you forget everything else. If you're searching for stories that pull your heart, challenge your mind, and keep you coming back, subscribe now. Your story begins the moment you choose to stay. 3 years earlier, Augusta, Georgia. 3 years earlier, Augusta, Georgia felt heavy with summer heat even after the sun went down. The air outside the convenience store carried that thick, damp feeling that stuck to clothes and skin, the kind people in Georgia stopped complaining about because there wasn't much point. Cars rolled slowly through the wet parking lot, while thunder grumbled somewhere farther out beyond the trees. Rain hammered against the gas station canopy hard enough to sound like gravel pouring onto metal. Demetria stood near the entrance holding a plastic grocery bag against her hip, while watching the storm with complete amusement. "This weather got personal problems," she muttered. The older cashier behind the counter laughed without looking up from his crossword puzzle. "You still waiting on that rain to apologize to you?" "It should," Demetria replied. "I done survived too much for my hair to lose tonight." Old school R&B played softly through the store speakers while she leaned against the doorframe watching people run through the rain toward their cars. A loud crack of thunder shook the windows. Demetria looked up immediately. "See? Extra dramatic for no reason." That was when she noticed him. A tall white man in a dark blue button-up stood near pump 4, staring up at the rain like he was trying to negotiate with it personally. He held an umbrella in one hand and a paper coffee cup in the other. Looking completely stuck, Demetria watched him for a second before smiling to herself. "He's scared of water?" she asked casually. The cashier glanced outside. "Nah, that man looked like he's scared of life." She laughed harder than she meant to. Unfortunately for Jacob, he heard it. He turned toward the store with a confused expression, while Demetria quickly pressed her lips together trying not to smile again. Too late. Jacob walked inside a moment later carrying the smell of rain and wet pavement with him. He looked clean-cut in a quiet kind of way, not flashy, just organized. The type of man who probably folded receipts neatly before throwing them away. Demetria noticed his shoes first. Definitely expensive. Definitely not made for puddles. Jacob stopped near the coffee station and glanced over carefully. "You laughing at me?" Demetria looked innocent immediately. "Depends. Were you out there fighting the storm?" His mouth twitched slightly, like he was trying not to smile. "I was deciding whether running for the truck was worth it. And I still haven't decided." She shook her head slowly. "You look like somebody who says words like, 'unfortunately,' during arguments." Jacob blinked once. What does that even mean? "It means you look polite under pressure." That finally made him laugh quietly. Not loud, not confident, more surprised than anything. Demetria noticed right away that he wasn't cold, just awkward. There was a difference. Most men who approached her tried too hard within the first 30 seconds. Too loud, too smooth, too rehearsed. Jacob looked like he was still figuring out whether conversations had rules he forgot to study for. "What's your name?" he asked after a second. "Demetria. I'm Jacob." "See?" she said immediately. "You absolutely look like a Jacob." Now he laughed for real. Outside, rain continued pouring across the parking lot, while headlights reflected against wet concrete in blurry streaks. Jacob picked up another coffee near the counter, before glancing toward her grocery bag. "You waiting for the storm to calm down too?" "Nah," Demetria said. "I'm waiting for courage." He looked confused again. "To run to my car without looking ridiculous." Jacob nodded seriously. "That's fair. See? There you go again." "What? You talk like somebody's responsible uncle." He shook his head while smiling down at the coffee cup. "You always roast strangers this quickly?" "Only the nervous ones." "I'm not nervous." Demetria raised an eyebrow. "You walked into this store holding an umbrella like it was emotional support." Jacob looked down at the umbrella in his hand and laughed again despite himself. Something about her felt easy. That surprised him. Usually, conversations drained him after a few minutes. Small talk especially, but Demetria filled silence naturally, like she'd known him longer than 10 minutes. Another crack of thunder hit outside. Demetria sighed dramatically. "Lord, if I make it to this car safely, I promise I'll stop spending money on candles." Jacob stared at her. "That's your emergency bargain? You got a better one?" He thought about it seriously enough to make her laugh again. For the next few minutes, they talked about almost nothing. Weather, traffic, Bad coffee. Why Georgia storms always felt aggressive, but somehow none of it felt forced. When the rain finally softened slightly, Demetria looked toward the parking lot and sighed. All right, time to risk my life. Jacob lifted the umbrella immediately. I can walk you to your car. She narrowed her eyes playfully. You always this formal? Probably. She said while heading toward the door. We definitely got to work on that. Jacob followed her outside, into the humid night air. Halfway to her car, Demetria reached for the umbrella. I got it. You sure? Jacob, she said, smiling at him sideways. It's rain, not combat. She climbed into her car, still laughing softly to herself. A few seconds later, Jacob looked down at his hand. The umbrella was still there. He smiled slowly, then deliberately left it leaning against her car before walking back into the rain himself. Jacob told himself he wasn't going back to that convenience store for any particular reason. That explanation lasted about 2 days. By the third afternoon, he was parked outside again, holding coffee he didn't even want, checking his phone every few minutes while pretending he wasn't waiting to see somebody. The bell above the store door rang. Demetria walked in wearing light blue scrubs and tired eyes that somehow still looked bright anyway. The second she spotted him near the coffee station, she stopped walking. Oh, you absolutely planned this. Jacob tried to stay calm. I was nearby. You don't believe me? Not even a little. She walked closer, smiling while grabbing a bottled tea from the cooler. You followed me over gas station coffee. I followed you over curiosity. That sounded practiced. It wasn't. That makes it worse. Jacob shook his head quietly while she laughed again. That became their rhythm after that. Small conversations turned into coffee runs. Coffee runs turned into late-night drives through Augusta, with music low in the background, while Demetria talked about everything she saw out the window. Sometimes she talked so much, Jacob barely spoke for 10 minutes straight. But he liked listening, liked the way she noticed things other people ignored. One evening, she pointed toward a tiny roadside barbecue stand with smoke rolling into the air. That place right there got the best ribs in Augusta. You've said that about 3 places, because I believe in giving people opportunities. You take food very seriously. You don't? Jacob glanced at her. I grew up eating casserole recipes with no seasoning. Demetria turned slowly in her seat. Oh. So, y'all suffered. He laughed harder than he expected to. The more time Jacob spent around her, the more relaxed he became without noticing it himself. Demetria saw it before he did. The stiff posture softened. The careful responses loosened up. Sometimes she'd catch him smiling before he realized it. A few weeks later, Demetria invited him to her aunt's backyard barbecue on a Sunday afternoon. Jacob almost said no, not because he didn't want to go, because he knew immediately he'd be out of place. You thinking too hard already, Demetria told him over the phone. I'm not. You got your serious voice on. I have a serious voice. All the time. By the time Jacob arrived at the house, music was already playing outside. Somebody was laughing loudly near the grill, while kids ran through the yard chasing each other with paper plates in their hands. The second Jacob stepped through the gate, he felt at least 6 people notice him immediately. Demetria walked over carrying a drink and grinned at his expression. You look like you entered enemy territory. I think your aunt just sized me up from 30 feet away. She sizes everybody up. That doesn't help. Before he could say anything else, Demetria pulled him toward the yard. The afternoon became chaos almost immediately. One cousin challenged Jacob to cornhole and complained he threw like an accountant. An older aunt asked him 3 personal questions within 60 seconds. Another relative stared at his tucked-in shirt and asked if he dressed like that voluntarily. Demetria nearly choked laughing the entire time. Then came the food. Jacob tried to stay confident right up until he bit into spicy mac and cheese that nearly ended his breathing temporarily. Demetria looked at him in disbelief. You sweating already? I'm fine. You sound emotional. It's aggressively seasoned. That's called flavor. At one point, music shifted and several family members started line dancing near the patio. Demetria grabbed Jacob's wrist instantly. Oh no, he said immediately. Oh yes. I don't know how to do this. That's what makes it fun. For the next several minutes, Jacob stumbled through dance steps while Demetria laughed so hard she had to hold onto his shoulder to stay upright. He missed turns, Stepped the wrong direction twice. Almost collided with somebody's aunt, but he kept trying anyway, and that mattered to Demetria more than getting it right. Later that evening, after most people left, Demetria walked into the kitchen carrying empty cups before stopping suddenly. Jacob stood near the sink, tightening a loose cabinet hinge with a screwdriver he'd found in a drawer. "You fixing my aunt's cabinet?" He shrugged lightly without looking up. It kept hanging uneven. "You came to a cookout and started repairing furniture?" It was bothering me. Demetria leaned against the doorway, watching him quietly for a second. Most people tried to impress others by talking. Jacob did things, small things, quiet things, the kind that were easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. That was the moment she realized something important about him. Jacob wasn't trying to survive being around her world anymore. He was trying to belong in it. Y'all ever meet somebody completely different from you, but somehow they still felt like home? If you have, comment below, because sometimes the people who understand us best are the ones we never expected to understand us at all. By the time summer started fading into fall, Jacob and Demetria had slipped into each other's lives so naturally it stopped feeling new. It just felt normal. Jacob started keeping sweet tea in his refrigerator because Demetria complained his kitchen looked emotionally dehydrated. Demetria started leaving hair ties in his truck without realizing it. Little things, quiet things, the kind people usually didn't notice until the relationship became serious. Most Friday nights turned into grocery store runs neither of them technically needed. Demetria treated grocery shopping like a social event. Jacob treated it like a military assignment. "You move through aisles like you're being timed," she told him one evening while placing cereal into the cart, "because normal people get what they came for and leave." "No," she said seriously. "Normal people judge strangers silently and buy snacks they don't need." Jacob pushed the cart slowly behind her. "You've turned shopping into sociology, and you've turned it into tax paperwork." She laughed at herself while reaching for chips on the top shelf. Jacob grabbed the bag before she could. Demetria looked at him for a second. "See? That right there." "What?" "You do nice stuff so casually, you don't even realize you're doing it." Jacob shrugged awkwardly. "It was close to me." But she noticed. She noticed all of it. The way he always walked closest to traffic, without thinking. The way he checked whether her car had enough gas. The way he remembered tiny details she mentioned once weeks ago. Jacob rarely said emotional things directly, but his actions stayed consistent, and after growing up afraid, people eventually left. Consistency meant everything to Demetria. Some nights they stayed home doing almost nothing at all. Demetria cooking while old music played softly from her speaker. Jacob sitting nearby, pretending not to watch her dance around the kitchen in socks. "You know," he said one night, "most people cook without performing." Demetria pointed a spoon toward him immediately. "Most people are unhappy." "I didn't say I was complaining." "You were thinking it aggressively, though." Jacob smiled down into his drink, while she continued swaying through the kitchen singing lyrics halfway wrong on purpose. That became one of his favorite things about her. Demetria brought life into rooms without trying. She made silence feel less heavy. And slowly, without realizing it, Jacob started talking more too. Not all at once, just little pieces. One night they fell asleep on the couch halfway through a movie neither of them were paying attention to. Around 2 a.m, Jacob woke up first. Demetria was curled against his chest, breathing softly, while the television glowed quietly across the dark living room. For a long moment, he just sat there, still, comfortable. That feeling was unfamiliar. Growing up, his house had always looked perfect from the outside. Clean dining room, quiet conversations, expensive furniture nobody relaxed on properly. But emotionally, everything stayed guarded. His father believed emotions complicated things, weakened people. Even happiness in their house always seemed controlled, measured. Demetria's world was different. People laughed loudly, talked over each other, argued honestly, said what they felt. The first time Jacob admitted that out loud during a late-night drive, Demetria looked over at him carefully. "That sounds lonely." Jacob kept his eyes on the road. "It wasn't bad." "That ain't what I said." He went quiet after that. Demetria rested her hand gently on his arm. "You don't gotta defend every painful thing just because it's familiar." Jacob swallowed hard at that. Nobody had ever said things like that to him before. Nobody had ever paid enough attention to notice, but not everything felt easy all the time. A few weeks later, Jacob invited Demetria to dinner with his parents. The entire evening felt polite. Too polite. His mother smiled often, but asked careful questions that sounded more like evaluations than conversations. How long have you been working at the clinic? Do you enjoy Augusta? You grew up on which side of town again? Nothing openly rude, nothing direct, but Demetria noticed the pauses, the subtle distance. Jacob noticed it too, especially whenever his father became unusually quiet. On the drive home, Jacob kept one hand on the steering wheel while the other rested near Demetria's leg like he always did. You okay? He asked softly. Demetria stared out the window for a few seconds before answering, yeah, but her voice sounded smaller than usual. Jacob tightened his grip on the wheel slightly. I know they can be formal. Demetria laughed softly without humor. That's a nice word for it. Jacob glanced at her. I'm sorry. That surprised her more than the dinner itself. Most people ignored uncomfortable moments. Jacob acknowledged them. Demetria leaned her head back against the seat. It's all right. But later that night, while washing dishes together in Jacob's kitchen, he walked over quietly and kissed her forehead. No speech, no dramatic apology, just warmth, steadiness, safety, and somehow that mattered more. A month later, Demetria came home from work exhausted and dropped her bag near the couch before noticing candles lit across the apartment. She blinked slowly. Jacob? He stepped out from the kitchen, looking more nervous than she'd ever seen him. You all right? She asked immediately. Jacob rubbed his hands together once before reaching into his pocket. Demetria stared at the ring box in his hand. Oh my God. I had a whole speech earlier, he admitted. It was better than this. She started laughing through sudden tears. That sounds accurate. Jacob walked closer slowly. I don't really know how to do big emotional speeches the way you deserve, he said honestly. But I know I want every version of life with you. The good ones, the hard ones. All of it. Demetria covered her mouth instantly. So, will you marry me? She didn't even let him finish fully before saying yes, then pulling him into the kind of hug that made both of them forget everything else for a little while. Their wedding happened on a warm Saturday afternoon in Augusta, beneath a white wooden pavilion behind Demetria's church. Nothing about it looked expensive, and nobody cared. Folded chairs filled the grass unevenly, while church aunties rushed around carrying food trays like the entire event depended on them personally. Somebody's cousin struggled with speaker wires near the reception tables while old soul music played too quietly at first before somebody finally fixed the volume. Demetria stood near the entrance holding her bouquet tightly, while trying not to cry too early. You already emotional? One of her relatives whispered. I paid for waterproof makeup, Demetria whispered back. I'm getting my money's worth. A few feet away, Jacob adjusted his tie for the 5th time that morning. You nervous? Demetria asked quietly once she reached him. Jacob looked at her for a long second before answering honestly, a little. She smiled immediately. Good. Means you got sense. The ceremony itself stayed simple. No giant decorations, no dramatic performance. Just two people standing in front of everybody they loved, trying to promise each other a future neither fully understood yet. Jacob's vows came first. His voice stayed calm at the beginning, then softer halfway through. I know I'm not always the best at saying things out loud, he admitted while looking directly at Demetria. But loving you has been the easiest thing I've ever done. Even on hard days, it still feels easy choosing you. Demetria pressed her lips together quickly, trying not to cry again. When it became her turn, she laughed first, before speaking. Jacob fixes things when he's nervous, she told everybody. Cabinets, doors, flat tires. Probably emotional problems too if Home Depot sold the right tools. People laughed softly around them, while Jacob shook his head, smiling. Then Demetria's expression changed gently. But the reason I love him isn't because he fixes things. It's because he stays, quietly, consistently, even when nobody notices. That line hit Jacob harder than he expected, because that was exactly how he loved. After the wedding, life settled into something ordinary, and honestly, that made them happy. Their first apartment sat above a small insurance office near downtown Augusta. The floors creaked near the kitchen. The bathroom sink took forever to drain, and the air conditioner made strange noises whenever it worked too hard. Demetria loved it immediately. It got personality, she said while unpacking boxes. It got plumbing problems, Jacob corrected. See? Negative. Jacob spent weekends fixing small things around the apartment, while Demetria filled empty spaces with candles, framed photos, blankets, and tiny decorations she swore they needed. One evening, Jacob came home carrying takeout after a 12-hour workday and stopped inside the doorway. What happened in here? Demetria looked up proudly from the couch. Transformation. You bought throw pillows. Exactly. There are 8 of them, and every single one matters. Jacob loosened his work boots slowly, while staring at the couch. There's nowhere left to sit. You sound ungrateful. Most nights follow the same rhythm after that. Jacob working long hours at the contracting business. Demetria coming home from the clinic talking about patients, co-workers, and random conversations she overheard during the day. Dinner together whenever schedules allowed. Television playing in the background while one of them half fell asleep on the couch first. The happiness between them never looked dramatic. That was the point. It lived in small routines. Jacob filling her gas tank without mentioning it. Demetria packing his lunch because she noticed he kept skipping meals. Hand touches while passing each other in the kitchen. Quiet forehead kisses before work. The kind of love people outside relationships usually overlooked because it didn't look flashy, but it felt steady, safe. One rainy evening, Demetria stood on a chair in the kitchen trying to hang a small framed picture near the table. Jacob walked in carrying groceries and sighed immediately. Why are you climbing furniture? Because greatness requires risk. You're 5 feet from the ground, and yet you still worried. Jacob set the bags down before automatically steadying the chair with one hand. Demetria smiled down at him softly. You always catch me. Jacob looked up at her. Yeah, simple answer, but she felt it. A few months later, life became busier. Jacob picked up more projects. Demetria started taking extra shifts at the clinic. Bills came faster than expected sometimes. Rent, car repairs, insurance, adult life. Still, they managed, mostly through teamwork and jokes. But one Tuesday afternoon, while Jacob was at work, Demetria stood alone in the kitchen pouring tea when sudden dizziness hit her so hard she grabbed the counter instantly. The room tilted sharply. Her stomach dropped. For a second, she genuinely thought she might faint. She squeezed her eyes shut, breathing slowly, while her heartbeat thudded unevenly inside her chest. After nearly a minute, the feeling eased slightly. Demetria stood there quietly staring down at the counter. Then she laughed nervously to herself. All right, she muttered softly. That was weird. But even after the dizziness passed, something about it stayed with her. At first, Demetria convinced herself the dizziness didn't mean anything serious. People got tired. People overworked themselves. People skipped meals and ran on coffee too long sometimes. That was normal. At least, that's what she kept telling herself. So instead of slowing down, she pushed harder. Extra shifts at the clinic. More errands after work. More late nights cleaning the apartment because she hated waking up to mess. Whenever Jacob noticed her sitting quietly too long, she brushed it off immediately. I'm fine, she'd say before he could even ask. And most of the time, he believed her, because Demetria still laughed constantly, still joked through exhaustion, still danced around the kitchen when music came on. But little things started changing slowly, small enough to ignore at first. One morning, Jacob found her standing motionless in front of the refrigerator before work. You okay? He asked, while tightening his watch. Demetria blinked once, like she'd forgotten he was there. Yeah, you've been standing there a while. I was thinking about what cereal deserves respect. Jacob stared at her. At 6:30 in the morning? That's when the important thoughts arrive. He shook his head, laughing softly, before kissing her forehead on the way out. But after the door closed, Demetria leaned against the counter heavily for a few seconds longer than usual. Her body felt tired in a way sleep wasn't fixing anymore. Not dramatic, not unbearable, just constant, like her energy kept draining faster than she could replace it. At the clinic, she stayed the same cheerful version of herself everybody expected, helping nervous parents, making sick children laugh, checking supplies, running between rooms. One little boy refused taking medicine unless Demetria made airplane sounds first. You manipulating healthcare professionals now? She asked him. The child nodded seriously. Yep. Demetria laughed and played along despite the dull ache spreading through her shoulders again. That became another thing she hid. Pain. Not sharp pain. More like deep soreness living inside her joints and muscles. Some mornings her hands felt stiff enough to make opening jars annoying. Other days her knees hurt after standing too long. Still, she ignored it. Mostly because she was scared of what doctors might say if she stopped ignoring it, and partly because money stayed tight. Not terrible, but tight enough. Jacob's business had good months and stressful months. One delayed payment or unexpected expense could throw everything off temporarily. Demetria knew that, which was exactly why she kept convincing herself she could wait a little longer before seeing somebody. One evening Jacob walked into the apartment and immediately frowned. "You didn't eat today?" Demetria looked up from the couch too quickly. "What?" "The lunch I packed is still in the fridge." "Oh, you forgot again?" She waved a hand casually. "Clinic got busy." Jacob set his keys down slower than usual. "That's the second time this week. I ate crackers." "That's not a meal." Demetria smiled tiredly. "Look at you sounding responsible." "I'm serious." "I know." Jacob studied her quietly for a second. There were faint shadows under her eyes now that hadn't been there a few months earlier. And she looked thinner too. Not drastically, just enough for somebody paying attention to notice. "You sure you're all right?" he asked, softly. Demetria forced another smile immediately. "Jacob, if I was dying, I'd tell you." The joke landed badly, mostly because Jacob didn't laugh. So she reached over and squeezed his hand gently. "I'm okay," she repeated more softly. And because he trusted her, he let it go. For now. A few days later, Demetria dropped a plate while unloading dishes because sudden weakness passed through her hand unexpectedly. The plate shattered across the kitchen floor. Jacob looked up instantly from the couch. "You cut?" "Nah," she said quickly. "Just committed violence against dinnerware." But when Jacob walked over, he noticed her fingers trembling slightly while she picked up broken pieces. "Baby, I'm fine." "You're shaking. It's probably caffeine. You don't even drink that much coffee." Demetria avoided his eyes while tossing broken ceramic into the trash. That night, Jacob fell asleep quickly beside her after another long workday. Demetria stayed awake. The apartment sat quiet, except for distant traffic outside and the ceiling fan turning slowly overhead. She carefully reached for her phone from the nightstand without waking him. Then she searched. Extreme fatigue and dizziness causes. A few minutes later, joint pain and trembling hands. Then, when should you worry about autoimmune symptoms? Demetria stared at the screen too long after that. The words made her stomach tighten. She clicked article after article while trying not to panic. Possible causes, chronic conditions, immune disorders, complications. Her chest started feeling tight the longer she read. Beside her, Jacob shifted slightly in his sleep and reached toward her automatically without waking up, his hand resting lightly against her leg like he needed reassurance she was still there. Demetria looked down at him quietly, then back at the glowing phone screen in her hand. Slowly, she locked the phone and set it face down. For a long moment, she just sat there in the dark, trying to convince herself not to be afraid. But fear had already started settling in anyway, even if she wasn't ready to say it out loud yet. By winter, the apartment started feeling smaller, not physically, emotionally. Jacob's contracting business became busier than usual after storm damage projects started piling up across Augusta. Some days he left before sunrise and came home long after dark smelling like sawdust, cold air, and exhaustion. Demetria tried supporting him the same way she always had. Warm dinners, late-night conversations, small jokes to keep tension light. But keeping up that version of herself became harder every week. The fatigue wasn't occasional anymore. It stayed. Some mornings her body felt heavy before she even got out of bed. Still, she pushed through it, because stopping meant admitting something was wrong, and Demetria wasn't ready for that yet. One evening, Jacob walked into the apartment carrying paperwork and immediately noticed the untouched bowl of soup sitting on the counter. "You didn't eat again?" Demetria kept folding laundry without looking up. "I wasn't hungry." "That's becoming your favorite sentence lately." "I ate earlier at work." Jacob loosened his jacket slowly. "You said that yesterday, too." Demetria sighed quietly. Jacob, please don't start. I'm not starting anything. I'm worried. I'm tired, that's all. You've been tired for months. The room went quiet for a second. Not angry quiet. Just heavy. Demetria folded another towel carefully before speaking again. You think I don't notice you barely sleeping lately? Jacob looked away immediately. That's different. How? Because work's busy. And my job isn't? That's not what I meant. She finally looked at him then. Her face softened almost immediately because she could already see how exhausted he looked, too. Dark circles under his eyes, shoulders tense, phone still buzzing with work calls every hour. Demetria walked over slowly and rested her hand against his chest. We're both tired, she said gently. That's all this is. Jacob wanted to believe her. So, he nodded, but the feeling in his stomach stayed anyway. A few days later, Demetria nearly dropped a tray at work after sudden weakness shot through her arms again. One of her co-workers noticed immediately. You all right? Demetria forced a smile. Apparently, my body just likes drama. You should get checked out. I will. But she didn't. Instead, she kept moving, helping patients, walking halls, ignoring the headaches becoming more frequent now too. At home, Jacob noticed more things without fully connecting them yet. Demetria, falling asleep on the couch before dinner, half-finished meals left untouched, pain medicine disappearing faster than usual. One night, while brushing her teeth, Demetria suddenly grabbed the bathroom sink hard after dizziness slammed into her again. The room tilted violently. Her knees almost gave out. For a terrifying second, black spots crowded her vision. She stayed frozen, gripping the sink, until the feeling slowly eased enough for her to breathe normally again. When Jacob knocked lightly outside the bathroom door, she straightened immediately. You okay? Yeah, she answered too fast. You been in there a while. I'm removing my makeup. You arguing with it? Demetria smiled weakly at her reflection before unlocking the door. Jacob studied her face carefully the second she stepped out. You sure you're all right? I'm okay. You look pale. Thank you for the romance. I'm serious. I know. He reached for her hand gently. That was when he felt it. Her fingers trembling again. Jacob frowned instantly. Demetria, I'm fine. You keep saying that because it's true. Then why won't you see a doctor? The question landed harder than either of them expected. Demetria crossed her arms slowly. Because I don't need one. How do you know? Because I know my body. Jacob let out a tired breath. Baby, people say that right before finding out something's wrong. The second the words left his mouth, Demetria's expression changed. Not angry. Hurt. You think I'm stupid? What? No. Then stop talking to me like I'm making bad decisions on purpose. I'm trying to help, and I'm trying not to turn every little symptom into a financial crisis. The room went silent immediately. Jacob blinked once. That part surprised him. Demetria. She looked away quickly. I said I'm fine, but her voice sounded thinner now, more fragile. Jacob rubbed his forehead slowly before speaking softer. We'll figure out money if something's wrong. That's easy to say until hospital bills start showing up. We're supposed to handle things together. I know, but even saying that sounded uncertain now. Later that night, after Jacob finally fell asleep, Demetria stood alone in the kitchen drinking water when sudden pain twisted through her body sharply enough to steal her breath. The cup slipped from her hand. Water splashed across the floor. Before she could steady herself, her knees buckled completely. Demetria hit the kitchen floor hard. For several terrifying seconds, she couldn't move properly. Her chest rose unevenly, while fear crawled slowly through her stomach. She stared at the ceiling, trying to stay calm, trying not to panic. Eventually, the dizziness eased enough for her to sit up, and instead of waking Jacob, she cleaned the spilled water quietly before going back to bed, like none of it happened. Some people get so used to carrying pain quietly, they stop realizing how serious it's become. If you've ever pushed yourself past your limits while pretending everything was okay, comment below, because sometimes the people suffering the most become experts at hiding it. 3 days later, Demetria was helping organize patient files at the clinic when the hallway suddenly tilted sideways. Voices blurred together. The folder slipped from her hands, and before she could catch herself this time, Demetria collapsed directly onto the clinic floor. Jacob's phone rang while he was standing inside a hardware supply warehouse arguing about delayed flooring materials. At first, he almost ignored it. Then he saw the clinic calling. Something inside him tightened immediately. "Hello? Is this Jacob?" The woman's voice sounded controlled in the careful way people sound when they're trying not to alarm somebody too quickly. "Yes, there's been a medical emergency involving your wife." Everything after that blurred together. Jacob barely remembered leaving the warehouse, barely remembered the drive. One second he was gripping the steering wheel too hard while running red lights through Augusta traffic, and the next he was sprinting through hospital doors trying to breathe normally. The emergency room looked too bright, too loud. Phones ringing, machines beeping, people moving quickly past each other carrying charts and supplies. Jacob reached the front desk, breathing hard. "My wife, Demetria." She was brought in from the clinic. The receptionist typed quickly, "Please have a seat. A doctor will speak with you soon." "No," Jacob said immediately. "I need to see her." "Sir, please." Something in his face must have convinced her, because a few minutes later someone finally led him through double doors into the emergency treatment area. The first thing Jacob noticed was the oxygen tube near Demetria's face. The second thing was how small she looked in the hospital bed. His chest tightened instantly. Demetria turned her head slowly when she saw him. Even then, even exhausted and frightened, she still tried smiling first. "Hey," she whispered weakly. Jacob moved beside the bed immediately. "What happened?" Demetria looked away briefly. "I got dizzy. You collapsed." Apparently my body likes making scenes. Normally that kind of joke would have earned a smile from him. Not this time. Jacob grabbed her hand tightly instead. Her skin felt colder than usual. That scared him more than anything so far. Over the next hour, nurses moved constantly around the room, checking monitors, drawing blood, asking questions. How long had symptoms been happening? Any family history? Pain levels? Medication history? Demetria answered quietly, while Jacob listened from the corner, feeling more confused every minute, because the questions sounded serious, too serious. One doctor mentioned inflammation markers. Another mentioned possible immune response complications. Then somebody used the phrase systemic involvement. Jacob didn't even fully understand what that meant, but the expressions on their faces made his stomach sink anyway. At one point, a nurse asked Demetria, gently, "How long have you been feeling this exhausted?" Demetria hesitated. "Couple months, maybe." Jacob stared at her immediately. "A couple months?" She avoided eye contact. "It wasn't this bad before. You told me you were fine. I thought I was managing it." Jacob turned away for a second, trying to control the panic climbing into his chest. Because suddenly, all the little moments from the last several months started replaying differently in his mind. The untouched meals, the trembling hands, the exhaustion, the dizziness, and the entire time she kept smiling through it. Hours passed slowly after that. Tests, waiting, more tests. The hospital settled into that strange late-night quiet, where everybody looked tired but nobody stopped moving. Jacob sat beside Demetria's bed, holding untouched coffee that had already gone cold. The bitter smell filled the room. He hadn't slept, hadn't eaten, hadn't even noticed how badly his back hurt from sitting in the same stiff chair for hours. Demetria watched him carefully from the bed. "You should go home for a little while." Jacob shook his head immediately. "No." "Jacob." "No." His answer came too fast, too sharp. Demetria went quiet after that. For the first time since Jacob met her, he realized she looked genuinely scared. Not stressed, not tired, scared. That realization hit him harder than any medical term had so far, because Demetria was usually the calm one, the comforting one, the person who joked during stressful moments. Now she kept glancing toward monitors whenever nurses walked in, like she was searching faces for answers nobody wanted to say out loud yet. Around 3 a.m, a doctor finally entered the room, holding another chart. Jacob stood immediately. "What's happening?" The doctor exhaled slowly before answering. "We're seeing signs of a severe autoimmune condition," he explained carefully. "But there are also additional complications we're trying to identify." Jacob frowned. "What kind of complications?" "We're still running tests." Demetria looked down at the blanket quietly. Jacob stared at the doctor, trying to read his expression. "Is she gonna be okay?" The doctor paused, just long enough to terrify him, then finally said, "We still don't fully understand what we're dealing with yet." After the second day, the hospital stopped feeling temporary. That was the part Jacob hated most. At first, he kept thinking they would get answers quickly, a diagnosis, a treatment plan, something simple enough to fix. Instead, every day brought more tests, more waiting, more words that sounded dangerous, autoimmune activity, organ stress, inflammation levels, monitoring progression. Jacob started learning medical language the same way people learn survival skills during emergencies, fast and unwillingly. By the fourth night, he could recognize the sound of Demetria's heart monitor changing before nurses even walked into the room. He knew which vending machines stole dollar bills. He knew the cafeteria closed too early. He knew hospital chairs were specifically designed to destroy lower backs. And he knew fear could make 20 minutes feel like 3 hours. Jacob barely went home anymore. Most nights he slept sitting upright beside Demetria's bed for maybe an hour at a time before waking suddenly every time a machine beeped differently. His beard started growing unevenly. His clothes wrinkled. Coffee became less of a drink and more of a survival tool. One morning, Demetria opened her eyes and found him asleep with his head tilted awkwardly against the side of the chair, one hand still resting near her blanket like he'd fallen asleep trying to make sure she was there. She watched him quietly for a moment. Even exhausted, Jacob still looked tense, like his body forgot how to relax completely. Demetria reached over weakly and touched his wrist gently. Jacob woke instantly. What happened? His voice sounded panicked before he was even fully awake. Demetria gave him a tired look. "You blink too hard and immediately prepare for war." Jacob rubbed his face slowly. "You scared me. I touched your arm." "Exactly." She smiled faintly, but the smile faded when she noticed how bloodshot his eyes looked. "When's the last time you slept in an actual bed?" "I'm fine." Demetria stared at him knowingly. "That's my line." Jacob looked down at the floor quietly after that, because hearing his own words repeated back at him felt different now. One afternoon, while Demetria slept through another round of medication, Jacob sat beside the window staring out at the parking garage across the street. Rain slid slowly down the glass. His phone buzzed again. Another work message. Another delayed project. Another client asking questions he barely had energy to answer anymore. Jacob leaned back in the chair and closed his eyes briefly. Hospital bills kept building in the back of his mind, whether he wanted them there or not. Insurance paperwork, specialists, testing, missed work days. Every conversation with doctors sounded expensive, and somehow Demetria still apologized every time another nurse walked in. "I'm sorry," she whispered once after hearing about additional scans. Jacob looked at her immediately. "For what? All this?" He frowned. "Demetria, I know it's a lot." Jacob leaned closer beside the bed. "Hey," she finally looked at him. "You do not apologize for being sick." Her eyes dropped again anyway. Jacob hated that. Hated seeing guilt mixed into her fear, so he kept joking whenever things became too heavy. Not because he found anything funny, because humor felt easier than falling apart. One evening a nurse brought Demetria another small hospital meal that looked vaguely depressing. Demetria poked at it weakly. "What exactly is this supposed to be?" Jacob glanced over. "I think legally they have to call it chicken." She smiled slightly. "Looks emotional." That mashed potato definitely gave up on life. Demetria laughed softly for the first time all day. The sound relieved him more than he expected. For a few seconds, she sounded like herself again. But moments like that never lasted long before reality returned. Machines, medication, waiting, fear. Late at night, when Demetria finally fell asleep, Jacob's mind drifted backward constantly, to grocery store runs, to her dancing badly in the kitchen on purpose, to the way she filled silence with random conversations during long drives, to lazy Sundays on the couch when life felt ordinary and safe. Now, every one of those memories felt sharper somehow, more valuable, like his brain was desperately trying to hold on to proof that normal life had existed before all this happened. One night, Jacob stepped out of the room quietly after another long conversation with doctors that explained almost nothing clearly. The hallway felt colder than usual. His body ached from exhaustion. He walked slowly toward the vending machines carrying cash he forgot was still in his pocket. The machine rejected his $3 3 times. Jacob stared at it blankly for a second, before trying again. Rejected. Again. Something about that tiny inconvenience hit him harder than it should have. He pressed both hands against the machine and lowered his head. For days he'd been holding everything together carefully. For Demetria, for doctors, for phone calls, for paperwork, for fear. But standing there alone beside humming vending machines and untouched snacks behind glass, something inside him finally cracked quietly. Jacob covered his mouth with one hand as tears hit him suddenly and hard. Not loud, not dramatic, just exhausted grief finally catching up to him all at once. He stayed there trying to breathe normally, while the hospital hallway carried on around him like the world hadn't changed at all. The seventh night felt quieter than the others. Not calmer, just heavier. Rain tapped softly against the hospital windows, while most of the hallway lights had been dimmed low enough to make everything feel distant and tired. Somewhere farther down the corridor, a television played quietly inside another patient's room. Demetria lay awake staring toward the ceiling, while Jacob sat beside the bed scrolling through his phone without actually reading anything on the screen. Neither of them had spoken much in almost 20 minutes. That had started happening more lately, not because they had nothing to say, because both of them were trying too hard not to say the wrong thing. Jacob finally set the phone down and looked toward her. "You need anything?" Demetria turned her head slowly on the pillow. "You ask me that every 6 minutes." Not true. It was 5 earlier. A weak smile touched his face, briefly. Hospital, hospitality, terrible customer service. Jacob leaned back slightly in the chair, studying her carefully. She looked exhausted again tonight. The medications helped some things, made other things worse. Some days, she looked stronger for a few hours, before crashing again by evening. Watching that happen repeatedly had started wearing on both of them. Demetria shifted slightly under the blanket before speaking again. "Did you call your mom back?" Jacob rubbed his jaw tiredly. "Yeah, what'd she say?" "The usual." "That tells me absolutely nothing." "She asked how you were doing." Demetria looked at him knowingly, and Jacob hesitated briefly. "She said they're praying for you." Demetria nodded once. "That's nice." Jacob noticed the pause after she said it. Not resentment, just distance. The same distance that always existed whenever his family came up. Even now, lying in a hospital bed, Demetria still measured her words carefully around that subject. Jacob hated himself a little for noticing how normal that had become. For a while, neither of them spoke again. The steady sound of the heart monitor filled the silence between them. Finally, Demetria broke it quietly. "Did you ever think we'd end up here this young?" Jacob looked down immediately. There it was. The question both of them had been avoiding for days. He tried reaching for humor automatically, the same way he always did when fear got too close. "Nah," he said softly. "You still owe me decades of arguing with cashiers and bullying grocery stores." Demetria smiled faintly. But this time, the joke didn't pull either of them very far from reality. "I'm serious," she whispered. Jacob looked at her again. Her eyes looked glassy with exhaustion, not crying, just emotionally worn down. "I thought maybe we'd have more time before life got this hard." That sentence settled heavily inside the room. Jacob leaned forward slowly, elbows resting on his knees. "We're gonna get through this. You don't know that. I know you." Demetria swallowed hard. "That's not the same thing." Jacob's chest tightened immediately, because for the first time since all this started, he heard genuine fear in her voice, not hidden, not covered by humor. Fear. Demetria stared down at her own hands resting weakly against the blanket. "I keep thinking about how much this is costing," she admitted quietly. "How tired you look all the time. How much work you're missing." "Stop. I'm serious." "So am I." She looked back at him. "You shouldn't have to carry all this." Jacob frowned instantly. "You are not all this." "But I am, though." "No." Demetria let out a shaky breath. "I hate needing this much help." Something about the way she said it hurt him deeply, because Demetria had always been the person helping everybody else. The one checking on people, cooking for people, showing up for people. Now she looked almost ashamed every time somebody adjusted her for or helped her sit up too quickly. Jacob moved closer beside the bed. "Listen to me." She stayed quiet. "You are my wife," he said softly but firmly. "Taking care of you is not some burden I'm carrying around. Demetria's eyes watered slightly at that, but she still looked unconvinced. That's easy to say right now. Jacob stared at her. What's that supposed to mean? She hesitated, then finally whispered the thing she'd clearly been afraid to say out loud. What if this doesn't get better? The room went completely still. Jacob opened his mouth once, before closing it again, because suddenly every possible answer felt wrong. Demetria watched his silence carefully, and somehow, that silence scared her more than words would have. A few seconds later, she reached weakly for his hand. Jacob? He grabbed it immediately. If something happens to me, no, please don't interrupt me this time. Her voice stayed soft. Too soft. Jacob felt his throat tightening already. Demetria looked at him for several long seconds before continuing. Promise me you won't shut everybody out. Jacob shook his head instantly. Don't talk like that. I need you to hear me. You're scaring yourself for no reason. Jacob. The way she said his name finally made him stop talking. Not because he agreed, because he could hear how serious she was. Demetria squeezed his hand weakly. You pull away when things hurt, she whispered. You go quiet. You try carrying everything alone. Jacob looked away immediately. Because she was right. I don't want you doing that if... She stopped briefly to steady her breathing. If things get worse. Jacob stared at the floor, trying to keep control of his emotions. You won't lose me, he said finally, but his voice sounded uncertain now, and both of them heard it. Demetria closed her eyes slowly after that. Still holding his hand, Jacob sat there beside her for a long time, listening to the monitor beep steadily, while fear settled deeper into his chest than ever before. Eventually, Demetria drifted asleep from exhaustion. Jacob carefully let go of her hand and stood up slowly. For a second, he just looked at her sleeping there in the hospital bed. Then he walked quietly toward the door, feeling like something inside him had started breaking apart piece by piece. And this time, he wasn't sure how to stop it. Jacob stepped out of Demetria's hospital room slowly, careful not to let the door close too loudly behind him. For a second, he just stood there staring down the empty hallway. Everything inside him felt worn thin. His chest hurt from holding too much emotion in for too many days straight. Fear, exhaustion, anger at himself, helplessness. He rubbed both hands over his face hard enough to wake himself up, then leaned briefly against the wall beside the room. Inside, Demetria was finally asleep. At least, physically. Jacob doubted either of them had truly rested all week. A nurse pushed a cart quietly past him before disappearing around the corner. Somewhere farther down the hall, somebody laughed softly for a moment before the sound faded again. Normal life continuing inside a place full of fear always felt strange to him. Jacob exhaled slowly and started walking toward the vending machines again, mostly because he didn't know what else to do with himself. Halfway there, voices near the nurses' station caught his attention accidentally. Two nurses stood reviewing charts while speaking quietly. Jacob wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but then he heard Demetria's name. She's responding a little better tonight, one nurse said softly while flipping through paperwork. The new results look more encouraging than earlier this week. Jacob slowed immediately. The other nurse nodded. I noticed that too, especially compared to when she first came in. Encouraging, the word hit him strangely, because nobody had sounded encouraging around him in days. Not doctors, not specialists, not test results. Jacob stayed still without meaning to. The second nurse lowered her voice further. I honestly think she waited too long before getting help. Definitely, the first replied. Based on the inflammation levels alone, she'd probably been dealing with symptoms for months. Jacob's stomach tightened instantly. Months, not weeks, months. His mind immediately flashed backward to all the moments he brushed aside, because Demetria smiled through them. The missed meals, the exhaustion, the trembling hands, the late nights pretending she was only stressed. One nurse sighed quietly while checking another page in the chart. She kept delaying specialist appointments. Financial reasons? Partly. Jacob frowned. Partly. The nurse nodded again. She apparently kept asking questions about treatment costs before she'd even ask about herself. The second nurse looked disappointed. That happens more than people realize. Jacob felt rooted to the floor now. His heartbeat slowed strangely inside his chest, because suddenly pieces started connecting in ways he hadn't fully understood before. Demetria picking up extra shifts, avoiding appointments, downplaying symptoms, joking whenever he worried. Not because she wasn't scared, because she was, and she'd been trying to protect him from it. The first nurse adjusted the chart again before speaking more quietly. What got me was how much she focused on him. What do you mean? She asked more questions about his stress than her own condition. Jacob looked down instantly. The hallway suddenly felt too quiet. She kept asking whether he'd been sleeping. The nurse continued softly. Whether somebody could convince him to go home more often. She seemed more worried about him burning out than herself. Something inside Jacob broke apart a little hearing that, because while he spent days grieving the possibility of losing her, Demetria had spent the same days worrying about him, even now, even terrified, even sick. His throat tightened painfully. The second nurse glanced toward Demetria's room. She really loves him. The first nurse nodded once. You can tell. Jacob looked away quickly, before either of them noticed him standing there. His vision blurred suddenly, not from exhaustion this time. From guilt, a deep, crushing kind of guilt that settled directly into his chest. Because for months, Demetria had been carrying fear alone while trying to protect him from pressure he never even realized she felt responsible for. Jacob slowly sat down in one of the empty hallway chairs near the vending machines. For a long moment, he just stared at the floor between his boots. Memories replayed differently now. Every joke, every dismissal, every "I'm fine," none of it had been carelessness. It had been fear mixed with love, and somehow that realization hurt worse than anything doctors had said all week. Jacob lowered his head into his hands quietly, then finally, completely silently. He started crying in the middle of the hallway with nobody around him, realizing his entire understanding of the last year had just changed. Jacob stayed in the hallway longer than he realized. At some point, the vending machines stopped humming loudly enough for him to notice. The hallway traffic faded into background noise. Everything inside his head had gotten too loud instead. He sat there with his elbows resting on his knees, replaying the last year of his marriage piece by piece. Except now every memory looked different than it had before. Not false, just clearer. For months, Jacob thought Demetria had been brushing things off because she was stubborn. Now he understood she'd been afraid. Afraid of doctors, afraid of answers, afraid of becoming another problem they couldn't afford. And somehow, even while carrying all that fear, she still spent most of her energy trying to make life easier for him. That realization stayed heavy in his chest while memories kept resurfacing one after another. Demetria insisting she already ate at work when she clearly hadn't. Demetria laughing off dizziness in the kitchen. Demetria changing the subject every time he asked whether she needed a doctor. At the time, Jacob thought she was avoiding difficult conversations. Now he realized she'd probably been trying to protect him from panic before she was even ready to face it herself. Jacob leaned back slowly against the hallway chair and stared toward the ceiling. His mind drifted to little moments he barely noticed before. Demetria quietly putting gas money back into his wallet after he paid bills, picking up extra clinic shifts without complaining, convincing him not to cancel work projects even when she looked exhausted. Even her jokes made more sense now. Humor hadn't just been part of her personality, it had been armor, a way to keep fear from taking over the room. Jacob rubbed both hands together slowly, because the more he thought about everything, the more guilt settled into him. Not guilt because he failed to love her. He loved her deeply. That part never changed. The guilt came from how much he missed emotionally, how often he accepted "I'm fine" because part of him wanted the answer to be true, how many times he stayed quiet himself instead of pushing harder when something felt wrong. Jacob had spent most of his life believing love meant handling problems quietly, providing, protecting, keeping things under control. But sitting there outside Demetria's hospital room, he realized something painful. You could love somebody completely and still fail to notice how much they were hurting if both people kept hiding their fear from each other. That thought stayed with him while he slowly stood up again. The hallway looked emptier now, late enough that even the nurses moved slower from exhaustion. Jacob walked back toward Demetria's room quietly, before stopping outside the door for a second. Through the small glass window, he could see her asleep beneath the blankets, one hand resting near her chest, monitors glowing softly beside her bed. She looked tired even while sleeping, and suddenly Jacob remembered something she once said months earlier while decorating their apartment. You know what scares me most? She asked casually, while hanging framed pictures. What? One day waking up and realizing we stopped noticing each other properly. At the time, Jacob laughed and told her she worried too much. Now the memory hit him, hard enough to make his chest ache. Because somewhere between work stress, bills, routines, and exhaustion, they both started hiding parts of themselves to protect the other person. And instead of bringing them closer, it slowly trapped both of them inside silence. Jacob entered the room carefully. Demetria didn't wake up. The chair beside the bed still sat slightly crooked from where he left it earlier. He lowered himself into it quietly and looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Then his eyes drifted toward her hands. Even now they looked smaller somehow compared to how alive and expressive they usually were while she talked or laughed or danced around the kitchen. Jacob reached over carefully and held her hand between both of his. Warm, still there. That thought alone nearly broke him again. His throat tightened hard, while emotion climbed up faster than he could stop it this time. Jacob lowered his head beside the bed quietly. And for the first time since this nightmare began, he let himself cry openly beside her, not hiding it, not swallowing it back, just grief, fear, love, relief that she was still breathing, regret for everything he never fully saw until now. Tears slid silently down his face, while Demetria slept through it beside him, unaware that something inside her husband had finally changed completely. Demetria woke up sometime just after sunrise. The hospital room looked pale and quiet in the early morning light filtering through the window. Machines still beeped steadily beside her bed, while the hallway outside slowly came back to life again. For a second, she looked confused. Then she noticed Jacob sitting beside her with his head lowered slightly, still holding her hand even though he'd clearly fallen asleep sometime during the night. Demetria studied him quietly. His face looked exhausted, not just physically, emotionally. She could see it now more clearly than before. Slowly, she squeezed his hand gently. Jacob woke immediately. The panic hit his face first before recognition settled in. You okay? Demetria gave him a tired look. You ask that before your brain even wakes up. Jacob exhaled softly and sat up straighter. Sorry. No, you're not. A weak smile touched his face briefly. But this time, neither of them rushed to fill the silence afterward. Something between them felt different now. More open, more honest. Jacob looked down at their hands for a few seconds before speaking quietly. I heard the nurses talking last night. Demetria's expression changed immediately. What nurses? They were discussing your test results. A flicker of concern crossed her face. How much did you hear? Enough. Demetria looked away toward the window. Jacob watched her carefully before continuing. I know you delayed seeing specialists. She stayed quiet. I know you were worried about treatment costs. Still silence. Jacob swallowed once before speaking more softly, and I know you were more worried about me than yourself. That finally made Demetria close her eyes briefly, not because she wanted to deny it, because she was tired of hiding. I didn't want everything falling apart, she admitted quietly. Jacob frowned slightly. We're talking about your health. I know. Then why were you carrying this alone? Demetria let out a slow breath before answering. Because I kept thinking maybe it wasn't serious yet. Jacob listened carefully, and when I realized maybe it was, her voice weakened slightly. I got scared. For the first time since entering the hospital, she finally looked directly at him, without hiding behind humor first. I saw how stressed you already were, she whispered. Work, bills, pressure, all of it. I didn't want to become another thing crushing you. Jacob stared at her in disbelief. Demetria, I know it sounds stupid. No, he said immediately. It sounds lonely. That answer caught her off guard. Tears gathered slowly in her eyes while Jacob moved his chair closer beside the bed. You should have told me how scared you were. Demetria laughed weakly through the emotion building in her chest. You first. Jacob looked down briefly because she wasn't wrong. He'd spent weeks acting like staying calm meant staying strong, like fear became less real if he kept it controlled enough. But none of that worked anymore. Jacob rubbed tiredly at his face before finally admitting the truth out loud. I've been terrified. Demetria's eyes softened instantly. Jacob shook his head slowly. Every time a doctor walked into this room, I kept thinking they were about to tell me something I couldn't survive hearing. The honesty in his voice hurt her more than she expected. I didn't know how bad it was, he continued quietly. And instead of talking about that fear, I just kept trying to hold everything together. Demetria stared at him silently for a few seconds before whispering, "You don't always have to do that." Jacob let out a small breath that almost sounded like a laugh. I'm starting to realize that. The room fell quiet again, but this silence felt different than the others. Not avoidance, not distance, just two exhausted people finally saying things they should have said much earlier. Demetria squeezed his hand weakly. I really was scared of becoming a burden. Jacob's expression tightened immediately. You are not a burden. But I felt like one. You're my wife, he said firmly. You don't have to earn care from me. Tears finally slipped down Demetria's face at that. Jacob moved carefully beside the bed and kissed her forehead gently, the same way he always did at home. Only now, the gesture carried everything both of them struggled to say properly. Fear, love, relief, commitment. Real love isn't about pretending to be strong all the time. Sometimes it's finally letting somebody see you scared. If you've ever had to learn that lesson the hard way, comment below, because vulnerability doesn't weaken love. Sometimes it's the very thing that saves it. A little later that morning, one of the doctors returned to discuss long-term treatment plans again. This time, when the conversation turned difficult, Demetria didn't avoid it. She listened carefully, asked questions honestly, and when the doctor explained, the next phase of treatment would require commitment, monitoring, and patience. Demetria looked over at Jacob beside her, then nodded slowly. Okay, she said quietly. Let's do it. And for the first time since arriving at the hospital, the future no longer felt completely impossible to both of them. Recovery didn't happen all at once. That became clear quickly. Some mornings, Demetria felt strong enough to sit up joking with nurses and asking for real food instead of hospital broth. Other mornings, even lifting her arms exhausted her. The doctors eventually explained the autoimmune condition more clearly after additional testing. Treatment would help manage it, but recovery depended on consistency, medication, monitoring, rest, and major lifestyle changes. Nothing about it sounded easy. Still, for the first time since entering the hospital, uncertainty no longer felt completely hopeless. Jacob held on to that carefully. The next few weeks settled into routines neither of them expected to learn so young. Medication schedules taped beside the bed, follow-up appointments, physical therapy exercises, insurance calls that lasted too long, paperwork stacked across hospital tables. Jacob handled most of it quietly, not because Demetria asked him to, because he wanted to, but something about him had changed now. Before, Jacob handled stress by shutting down emotionally and carrying everything silently. Now he talked more, not perfectly, not constantly, just honestly. One afternoon, while helping Demetria walk slowly down the hospital hallway during physical therapy, Jacob noticed her frustration immediately. You all right? I hate this. What part? All of it. She looked down at the walker in front of her. I used to work 12-hour shifts. Jacob nodded quietly. Now, walking to the hallway feels like training for the Olympics. There was humor in the sentence, but sadness too. Jacob moved closer beside her. You're recovering. I'm struggling. You can be both. Demetria looked at him for a second after that. Before the hospital, he probably wouldn't have said something like that out loud. Now he stayed emotionally present even during difficult moments, instead of trying to fix everything immediately. That mattered more than either of them expected. Money became tighter after the hospital stay. Jacob sold equipment he rarely used, canceled projects he didn't have time to manage properly. Demetria worried about it constantly at first, until Jacob finally sat beside her one evening and said quietly, "We'll rebuild money." She looked down at her hands. I still feel guilty. I know. You're not mad? Jacob looked genuinely confused. At what? At everything changing. He shook his head slowly. I almost lost you. That answer silenced her immediately, because suddenly bills felt smaller than what almost happened. Recovery stayed uneven after that. Some days Demetria laughed easily again. Other days pain and exhaustion returned without warning. But now she stopped pretending those days didn't exist. And Jacob stopped pretending he wasn't scared during them too. One cool afternoon, nearly a month after her hospitalization began, A nurse finally wheeled Demetria toward the hospital exit for supervised outdoor recovery time. The automatic doors opened slowly. Fresh Georgia air drifted inside immediately. Demetria closed her eyes. The second sunlight touched her face. For a moment, she just sat there breathing quietly while traffic moved faintly somewhere beyond the parking lot. Jacob stood beside her, watching carefully. "You okay?" he asked softly. Demetria opened her eyes slowly and looked up at the sky, then smiled. Not the forced smile she'd been using for months, a real one. "Yeah," she whispered. "I forgot outside existed." Jacob laughed quietly for the first time in days, and standing there beside him beneath open sky again, Demetria finally allowed herself to believe she might actually have a future beyond that hospital room. Coming home felt stranger than either of them expected. For weeks, the hospital had become its own world. Timers, medications, machines, nurses checking vitals at random hours. Now suddenly there was silence again. Their apartment looked exactly the same, but both of them had changed inside it. Jacob carried Demetria's overnight bag through the front door, while she stepped inside slowly behind him. The familiar smell of candles and laundry detergent hit her almost immediately. Demetria looked around quietly. "I missed this couch more than I missed some people." Jacob glanced over. "That couch nearly destroyed my back for 2 years. And yet, still family." He smiled softly while setting her bag down. Recovery at home came with adjustments neither of them fully expected. Demetria hated needing help with simple things at first. Jacob noticed every time she tried hiding exhaustion again. The difference now was that he didn't pretend not to see it anymore. One evening, Demetria reached for grocery bags before Jacob stopped her immediately. "I got those. I can carry one bag. You carried enough by yourself already." The sentence caught her off guard. She looked at him quietly for a second before letting go of the handles without arguing. That alone showed growth. A month earlier, she would have forced herself through pain just to prove she still could. Some nights they cooked dinner together again slowly. Not elaborate meals. Simple things. Pasta, rice, chicken, soup on colder evenings. Demetria still danced around the kitchen sometimes whenever old music played from her speaker, although now her movements tired her faster than before. Jacob noticed the moment fatigue started creeping into her posture every single time. "Sit down for a minute," he'd say gently. "You always ruining my performances. You got limited tour dates right now." She rolled her eyes dramatically before sitting anyway. That became part of their new rhythm too. Demetria learning rest wasn't weakness. Jacob learning care didn't always mean fixing things alone, silently. One rainy evening they sat together on the couch, eating takeout containers directly from their laps, while some old movie played quietly in the background. Demetria leaned against him comfortably beneath a blanket. "You know what's weird?" she asked. "What?" "I used to think normal life was boring." Jacob looked down at her. "And now?" She glanced around the apartment slowly. The soft lamp near the couch, half-folded laundry nearby, rain tapping gently against the windows. "You realize these little moments are actually the big moments." Jacob stayed quiet after that because he understood exactly what she meant. Hospital rooms changed the value of ordinary life permanently. Now grocery store trips felt meaningful. Morning coffee together mattered. Even arguing over thermostat settings felt strangely comforting. Later that night, while cleaning dishes together, Demetria noticed Jacob watching her thoughtfully. "What?" He dried his hands slowly before answering. "I've been thinking about something. That already sounds dangerous." Jacob smiled faintly. "I thought loving you meant protecting you from everything." Demetria's expression softened immediately. Jacob looked down briefly before continuing. "I didn't realize I was supposed to let you lean on me too." The honesty in his voice hit her harder than any dramatic speech ever could have. Because for most of their relationship, Jacob carried love quietly through actions. Now he was finally learning how to say it too. Demetria stepped closer slowly and rested her forehead against his chest. Neither of them spoke for a few seconds. They didn't need to. The silence between them finally felt peaceful again instead of afraid. By spring, life finally started feeling familiar again. Not exactly the same, but steadier. Demetria still had difficult days sometimes. Doctor appointments remained part of their routine. Medication stayed lined up neatly beside the kitchen counter, and fatigue still arrived without warning now and then. But fear no longer controlled every room they walked into. That alone felt like progress. One Sunday afternoon, Demetria's family hosted another backyard barbecue in Augusta, just like the one Jacob attended years earlier, when everything between them was still new. Music floated through the yard, while smoke curled from the grill into warm Georgia air. Kids ran through folding chairs, laughing loudly, while older relatives argued over card games near the patio table. Only this time, Jacob looked different inside the chaos. Relaxed, comfortable, like he no longer felt the need to measure every movement carefully before making it. Demetria noticed it immediately while watching him near the grill talking with her cousins. "You realize they like you now?" she teased after walking over beside him. Jacob glanced toward the yard. "I think your aunt threatened me into belonging. She does that with love." "That explanation concerns me." Demetria laughed softly. The sound still felt precious to him, not because laughter disappeared during the hospital months, because he understood now how fragile ordinary happiness could become when life changed suddenly. Later that afternoon, music started playing louder near the patio again. One of Demetria's relatives immediately pointed toward Jacob. "Oh no," Jacob muttered. Demetria grinned. "Oh yes. Absolutely not. You survived last time." "Barely." Still, a few minutes later, Jacob stood awkwardly inside another line dance surrounded by laughing relatives while Demetria nearly doubled over watching him miss half the steps again. But this time, he laughed at himself too. That was new. The old version of Jacob hated looking foolish. The newer version cared less about dignity and more about moments. And somewhere along the way, that emotional change softened him in ways Demetria quietly loved. As the evening slowed down, Jacob sat beside Demetria near the patio, holding 2 paper plates balanced carefully in his hands. "You tired?" he asked softly. "A little. Want to head home soon?" Demetria nodded. But before standing, she leaned gently against his shoulder for a second longer than usual. Small gesture, quiet trust. Months earlier, she probably would have hidden the exhaustion instead. Now she allowed herself to lean on him openly. That mattered. The drive home felt calm. Windows cracked slightly. Old music playing softly through the speakers. Jacob kept one hand resting near hers the entire ride, the same way he always used to before hospital rooms and fear interrupted everything. Only now, neither of them took those little touches for granted anymore. Later that night, Demetria stood barefoot in the kitchen, reheating leftovers, while music drifted softly through the apartment again. Jacob leaned against the doorway, watching her sway slowly while stirring food at the stove. The moment looked almost identical to dozens of ordinary nights before everything changed. But now he understood why those moments mattered so much. Not because life became perfect afterward, because life stayed uncertain, and ordinary moments were never as ordinary as people believed while living through them. Demetria turned slightly and caught him staring. "What?" Jacob smiled quietly. "Nothing. You doing the emotional staring thing again." "Probably." She laughed softly before reaching for his hand and pulling him into the kitchen beside her. Old music played. Dinner warmed on the stove. Outside, Augusta traffic moved quietly through the night. And for the first time in a long time, both of them finally felt present inside their own lives again. He used to think love was measured by how much you could carry alone. Demetria taught him it was also knowing when to let somebody carry you, too.